The price was a horse? The catch?
Two women who spoke no English and knew all his secrets. Wild West story, the gunshot missed Jake Carson by 3 inches. He dove behind the water trough as splinters exploded from the saloon door frame where his head had been. The horse dealer from Santa Fe wasn't supposed to know about the stolen cattle. Someone had talked. Jake rolled left as another bullet punched through the trough, water streaming out in an arc. His hand found his revolver, but his ammunition belt lay on his saddle across the street. 3 bullets left in the chamber. The dealer had at least 6 men. He sprinted for the alley, boots pounding dirt as shots cracked behind him. A bullet tugged his vest. Another sparked off a hitching post. He rounded the corner and slammed into someone, sending them both sprawling. A woman, dark hair, darker eyes, and a knife already in her hand pressed against his throat before he could blink. She said something sharp in a language he didn't recognize. Not Spanish, not Apache, something else entirely. Her companion appeared from nowhere, another woman, slightly older, holding a rifle aimed at his chest. She spoke in the same strange tongue. The first woman's knife didn't waver. Jake heard boots thundering toward the alley. The dealer's men. He had maybe 10 seconds. He pointed at the approaching sound and then at himself, making a throat-cutting gesture. The women exchanged glances. The older one lowered her rifle slightly and jerked her head toward a recessed doorway. The younger woman pulled him roughly to his feet, knife still ready, and shoved him into the shadows. They pressed against him as the dealer's men rushed past, their foreign words hot against his ear as they held him silent. When the boots faded, the older woman stepped back but kept her rifle trained on him. She said something that sounded like a question. Jake showed his empty palms. The younger woman searched him efficiently, finding his revolver, his pocket watch, and the bank letter in his coat that he really wished she hadn't found. She read it, frowned, and showed it to her companion. They spoke rapidly to each other, and Jake caught the only English word in their entire conversation: wanted. The older woman smiled, but it wasn't friendly. She gestured for him to follow them. Jake weighed his options. The dealer's men were hunting him. He had 3 bullets and no horse. These women had just saved his life, but clearly knew he was running from something. The younger one still had his gun. They led him through a maze of back alleys to a stable on the edge of town. Inside stood the most beautiful horse Jake had ever seen. Black as midnight with a white star on its forehead, easily 17 hands high, muscles rippling under its coat, a stallion worth $500 minimum, maybe $1,000. The kind of horse that could outrun anything on 4 legs between here and California. The older woman pointed at the horse, then at Jake, then held up 2 fingers and pointed at herself and her companion. The meaning was clear. The horse was for sale. The price was taking both women with him. Jake studied them. They wore practical traveling clothes, carried their weapons like they knew how to use them, and had somehow ended up in this Arizona Territory town speaking no English. Running from something themselves, no doubt. The younger one couldn't have been more than 25, the older one maybe 40. Both had the kind of eyes that had seen hard miles. The dealer's men were still searching. Jake needed to leave town now. This horse could do it. But 2 passengers who couldn't speak English and apparently knew he was wanted for something? That was asking for complications. The older woman said something else, and the younger one pulled a folded paper from her pack. She opened it carefully. It was a map marked with a route from Arizona Territory north through Utah and into Wyoming. Someone had drawn circles around 3 towns and written notes in that same foreign script. The final destination was marked with an X and a single English word: family. They needed to get north. He needed to get anywhere that wasn't here. The horse stood between them like a promise and a problem rolled into one. Jake heard shouting from the street. The dealer's men were getting closer, checking every building. He looked at the horse, at the women, at the door. The younger woman still held his revolver. She'd saved his life, but she also had him cornered. Smart. He nodded once. The older woman smiled, satisfied, and gestured to the saddle. It was built for one rider, but there were bedrolls strapped behind it. They'd been planning this. The younger woman handed him back his gun, empty. She showed him the bullets in her palm, then pocketed them. Also smart. Jake swung onto the horse. The stallion shifted under him, powerful and eager. The older woman climbed up behind him, surprisingly spry. The younger one mounted her own horse, a sturdy mare, and led another pack horse from a stall. They'd been ready to leave all along. They'd just been waiting for the right person desperate enough to take their deal. The back door of the stable opened onto a canyon trail. They could hear the dealer's men breaking into buildings now, getting systematic. The older woman said something urgent. The younger one kicked her mare forward. Jake followed, and the black stallion moved like liquid darkness, smooth and fast. They rode hard for 2 hours before stopping at a creek. The women worked together efficiently, watering the horses and checking their supplies. Jake watched them communicate in their wordless language of gestures and glances, the kind of understanding that came from years together. Sisters, maybe. Or something else. The younger woman brought him a canteen and some dried meat. She sat across from him, still wary, and spoke slowly in her language, as if hoping he might suddenly understand. When he shook his head, she drew in the dirt, a picture of mountains, a picture of men with guns, a picture of her and the older woman running. Then she pointed at the bank letter still tucked in his coat and raised her eyebrows. Jake pulled it out and showed her. It was a warrant letter, technically. He'd been accused of rustling cattle from a ranch owned by a territorial judge. The cattle had actually been stolen by the judge's own son, but the son had blamed Jake, and the judge had believed him. There was a $500 reward for Jake's capture. Dead or alive. The woman studied the letter, then showed it to her companion. They talked for a long moment. Then the older woman drew her own picture in the dirt. Men with guns chasing them, too. She pointed at Jake's wanted letter, then at herself and made a cutting motion across her throat. Whatever they were running from, it was deadly. The younger woman pointed north, at the map's destination and then at Jake. She was asking if he'd take them all the way, not just out of town, all the way to Wyoming. That was weeks of travel through hostile territory with 2 women who couldn't speak English and apparently had killers on their trail. Jake looked at the black stallion drinking from the creek. Already he could feel the difference. This horse was special. With this horse, he could disappear completely, start over somewhere new. But these women knew his secret now, and he knew theirs. They were tied together whether he liked it or not. He took a stick and drew a line from where they were, all the way north to the X on their map. Then he pointed at himself and nodded. The older woman clasped his shoulder, approving. The younger one didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened slightly. They had a deal. As the sun set behind them, they rode north into territory Jake had never seen before. 3 fugitives on a trail that promised either freedom or death, bound together by a horse and secrets they couldn't speak aloud. The mountains rose dark against the stars. Somewhere behind them, men were coming. Somewhere ahead, other men waited. And between here and safety lay 1,000 miles of wild country where anything could happen. Jake checked his revolver, still empty. The younger woman had his bullets. He was riding into the unknown with 2 armed strangers who held all the cards. But the black stallion moved like a dream beneath him, and for the first time in 3 months, he felt like he might actually make it out alive. The older woman said something that might have been a prayer or a warning. The younger one replied softly. They rode on into the darkness, and Jake Carson wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into, and whether the price of this horse would end up being more than he could pay. 2 days into the journey, Jake learned the first crucial fact about his traveling companions. They were being followed, and not by the same men chasing him. He noticed it at dawn when the younger woman climbed a ridge to scout their back trail. She returned, moving faster than before, speaking urgently to the older woman. They broke camp in minutes, throwing dirt on the fire and erasing signs of their presence with practiced efficiency. Jake tried asking with gestures what they'd seen, but the younger woman just shook her head and pointed north. They rode hard until midday, then cut west into a canyon system Jake didn't recognize. The black stallion handled the rough terrain like it had been born in these rocks. The women's horses struggled more, but kept pace. By afternoon, they'd put 20 miles between themselves and the main trail. They stopped in a box canyon with only one entrance. The older woman positioned herself on a boulder overlooking their approach, while the younger one tended the horses. Jake gathered firewood, feeling useless. Without bullets for his gun and unable to communicate, he was dead weight. The women knew it too. He caught them exchanging glances when they thought he wasn't looking. That night, the younger woman approached him with his bullets. She counted out 3 and placed them in his palm, then put the rest back in her pocket. Her message was clear. Enough to protect himself in an emergency, not enough to betray them. Jake loaded his revolver slowly, aware of her watching every movement. When he finished, she nodded once and returned to the fire. The older woman was cooking something that smelled better than anything Jake had eaten in weeks. She gestured for him to sit and handed him a bowl, some kind of stew with meat and roots he didn't recognize. It was delicious. He said thank you in English, and the older woman repeated the sounds, mangling them. The younger one laughed, the first time Jake had heard her make that sound. It transformed her face. After dinner, the younger woman pulled out her map again and traced their route. They'd covered good ground, but had veered west off the planned path. She pointed at a town marked on the map 3 days north, then looked at Jake questioningly. He knew that town. Silver Creek. Medium-sized, with a sheriff who asked too many questions. Jake shook his head firmly and traced an alternate route around it. The woman frowned but nodded. She drew 3 figures in the dirt. Herself, the older woman, and Jake. Then she drew 5 figures behind them. The pursuers? She pointed at the 3 figures ahead and made a shooting gesture, then pointed at the 5 behind and made a cutting gesture across her throat. Different enemies with different methods. Jake understood. The men chasing him would arrest him or shoot him for the reward. The men chasing the women wanted them dead for something else entirely. Jake pointed at the 5 figures and raised his eyebrows. Who were they? The younger woman hesitated, then drew a symbol he didn't recognize, some kind of crossed lines with a circle. She pointed east and said a word that sounded like a name. Victor. She spat after saying it. The older woman looked away. Over the next week, Jake learned their rhythm. The older woman, whom he started thinking of as Ruth, though that wasn't her name, always woke first and scouted the area. The younger woman, probably named something he couldn't pronounce, tended the horses and managed their supplies. They worked together like a single organism, anticipating each other's needs without speaking. Jake tried to make himself useful, hunting when they had time to stop, keeping watch at night, maintaining the equipment. The black stallion became his closest companion. The horse was intelligent, responding to the smallest cues, always alert to danger. Jake suspected it had been stolen from someone important, which explained why the women had been so eager to trade it. They needed to get rid of it fast and get moving. He'd been convenient. On the 8th day, they hit their first real trouble. A group of miners had set up a checkpoint across the canyon they needed to traverse. The miners weren't official, just opportunists charging travelers for passage. 3 rough men with shotguns and attitudes. Ruth wanted to go around, but the younger woman, whom Jake had started calling Grace in his head, pointed at their water supply. They were running low and the next source was 2 days away. They had to go through. Jake rode forward alone, raising his hands peacefully. The miners looked him over, noted his gun, noted the women behind him. One of them smiled unpleasantly and said something about a toll. Jake asked how much. The miner's smile widened. $20 or one of the women for the night. Jake felt Grace tense behind him, even though she couldn't understand the English. He kept his voice level. $30 and they'd pass through no trouble. The miner laughed and raised his shotgun. That's when Grace did something Jake hadn't expected. She rode forward, dismounted and approached the miner with her hands up, speaking in her language. The miner frowned, confused. Grace smiled at him, still talking. And then she moved. Her knife appeared from nowhere and was at his throat before anyone could react. She spoke again, still smiling, but her voice had gone cold as winter. The other 2 miners raised their weapons, but Ruth already had her rifle trained on them from horseback. Standoff. Jake drew his revolver with his 3 bullets and aimed at the second miner. He spoke quietly. The women are not negotiable. We'll pay $30 and everyone walks away. The miner with the knife at his throat tried to nod carefully. Grace pressed harder, drawing a thin line of blood, and said something that needed no translation. Try anything and you die first. Jake counted out $30 from his rapidly depleting funds and dropped it on the ground. Grace backed away from the miner slowly, knife still ready. They mounted up and rode through the checkpoint at a walk, never turning their backs, ready for treachery. It didn't come. The miners apparently decided $30, and their lives were better than whatever they'd been planning. 2 miles later, Grace returned Jake's remaining bullets to him, all of them. Ruth nodded approvingly. They'd passed some kind of test. Jake was part of the group now, not a passenger. It felt different riding after that. They were a team. The territory grew rougher as they pushed north. They avoided towns, traded with isolated homesteaders for supplies, slept in caves and under overhangs. Grace proved to be an excellent hunter, bringing down rabbits and once a young deer with her rifle. Ruth had a gift for finding water and safe camping spots. Jake contributed his knowledge of the land and his increasingly useful ability to talk their way past occasional travelers who got curious. On day 12, they found the first body. A man, dead maybe 3 days, shot in the back, stripped of weapons and supplies. Ruth examined the corpse carefully and found something Jake missed. A small brand burned into the man's arm. The same crossed lines with the circle that Grace had drawn in the dirt, one of their pursuers.
Grace's face went white.
She and Ruth had a rapid, heated conversation. Ruth kept pointing north, insisting. Grace kept shaking her head, pointing at the body, then back the way they'd come. They were arguing about splitting up. Ruth wanted to continue to Wyoming. Grace wanted to lead their pursuers away, save Ruth even if it cost her own life. Jake interrupted by stepping between them and pointing at all three of them, then north. They stayed together, or he stopped riding. Simple as that. Grace looked at him, surprised. Ruth studied his face for a long moment, then said something to Grace that made the younger woman's eyes shine. They mounted up and kept going north, together. That night, Grace tried to teach Jake words in her language. Simple things. Water. Fire. Danger.
Horse.
He was terrible at pronunciation, and she laughed at his attempts, but kept teaching. Ruth watched them, smiling slightly. The older woman hummed sometimes while cooking, sad melodies that Jake felt in his chest even though he didn't know the words. They crossed into Utah territory on day 15. The land opened up into vast red rock formations and impossible canyons. Beautiful and deadly, water became scarce. They rationed carefully, pushing the horses only as hard as they dared. Jake shot a prairie dog that Grace turned into a surprisingly good meal. They found a spring that saved them from turning back. On day 17, the men caught up to them. Not the ones chasing Jake, Victor's men. There were 4 of them riding hard from the southeast. Grace spotted them from a ridge and they ran. The black stallion proved his worth, stretching out into a gallop that 8 miles. Ruth and Grace's horses couldn't match the pace. Jake had to slow down or leave them behind. They made it to a rocky outcrop as the sun set. Defensible position, but they were trapped. The 4 riders circled below, staying out of rifle range, waiting. They had time and numbers. Jake had 3 bullets. Grace had maybe 15 rounds for her rifle. Ruth carried a pistol with an unknown count. Not enough for a firefight. As darkness fell, one of the men rode closer, staying barely in earshot. He shouted something in Grace and Ruth's language. Grace shouted back, angry. The man laughed and replied. Grace's hands shook with rage. Ruth put a hand on her shoulder, calming her. Jake asked with gestures what the man had said. Grace drew in the dirt. A house. A fire. People inside. Then she pointed at herself and Ruth and made a running gesture. They'd escaped from something, and Victor was the one who'd said it. The man below had just told them Victor was coming personally to finish what he started.
They had until dawn. Ruth and Grace talked quietly, planning
Jake watched the men below.
3 on their side.
Bad odds, but not impossible. The outcrop had good cover and limited approaches. If they could hold until dawn, maybe the men would give up. Or maybe Victor would arrive with reinforcements and it wouldn't matter. Grace touched his arm and pointed at the black stallion, then at the open desert beyond the outcrop's backside. She wanted him to run, save himself. The horse could make it if it only carried 1 rider. Jake would get away clean while Grace and Ruth held off their pursuers. It was logical. It was also abandonment. Jake shook his head. He'd made a deal. He'd take them to Wyoming or die trying. Grace argued with gestures, but Jake ignored her, checking his gun, gathering rocks they could throw if they ran out of bullets, preparing for a siege. Ruth watched him, then said something to Grace that ended the argument. They prepared together. The night stretched long and cold. The men below built a fire, taunting them with warmth and confidence. Jake took first watch while the women rested. Around midnight, one of the men tried sneaking up the rocks. Grace's rifle shot cracked the silence and the man scrambled back down, cursing. No more attempts after that. At 3 a.m, Ruth woke Jake for his rest shift. He couldn't sleep. His mind raced through scenarios, plans, desperate gambits. They had maybe 3 hours until dawn and Victor's arrival. 3 hours to figure out how to survive. Grace sat apart from them, staring at the stars. Jake joined her. She glanced at him, then back at the sky. She said something softly in her language, maybe a poem or a prayer. It sounded beautiful. Jake wished he could understand. She pointed at a constellation and traced its shape, then pointed at herself. Home, maybe. Wherever she'd come from before Victor and running in this desperate flight north. She pulled out a small object from her shirt. A locket. She opened it carefully and showed Jake. 2 pictures, worn and faded. A young couple. Her parents, probably. Both looked serious, dressed in formal clothes from some country Jake couldn't identify. Grace touched the pictures gently, then closed the locket and tucked it away. Jake understood. She was preparing to die, making peace with it. He grabbed her shoulder and shook his head firmly. Not today. They were getting out of this, all 3 of them. Grace smiled sadly, not believing him, but grateful for the sentiment. As dawn approached, Ruth joined him. The three of them sat together watching the sky lighten, each lost in their own thoughts. Below, the men stirred their fire back to life and checked their weapons. Somewhere out there, Victor was coming, and Jake Carson had to figure out how to keep two women alive who'd trusted him with their lives based on nothing but a horse and a handshake he couldn't even explain in words they'd understand. The morning sun painted the rocks red and gold, beautiful and terrible. A fine day to survive or die. Jake checked his gun one more time. 3 bullets, he'd have to make them count. The dawn brought unexpected silence. The 4 men below didn't move as the sun rose, just stood near their fire drinking coffee and watching the outcrop. Waiting. If they were confident enough to just wait, that meant Victor was close. Maybe an hour away. Maybe less. Ruth studied the terrain through gaps in the rocks, mapping escape routes that didn't exist. The outcrop's backside dropped 40 feet onto jagged stones. The front was the only way down, and the men had it covered. They were pinned and everyone knew it. Grace made a decision. She stood up, clearly visible, and shouted down to the men. Her voice carried sharp and clear in the morning air. One of the men shouted back. They had a conversation, quick and heated. The man laughed at something Grace said. She didn't laugh back. She kept talking, her voice getting calmer, more reasonable. Negotiating. Ruth grabbed her arm, alarmed, but Grace shook her off gently. She called down again. The man considered, then nodded. He gestured to his companions and they backed away from the outcrop space, giving space. Grace turned to Ruth and spoke urgently, pointing at Jake, then at the black stallion, then north. Ruth's face crumpled. She understood what Grace was proposing. Jake didn't need translation. Grace was trading herself for their escape. She'd surrender to Victor's men in exchange for Ruth and Jake riding free. Ruth was arguing, crying now, begging in that language Jake couldn't understand but felt in his bones. Sisters. They were sisters. The way they moved together, protected each other, the looks they shared. Not blood maybe, but something deeper. And Grace was offering to sacrifice herself. Ruth grabbed Grace's face, speaking rapidly, desperately. Grace just smiled and touched Ruth's cheek, then pushed her gently toward the horses. She looked at Jake and pointed north, then at Ruth, then clasped her hands together. Keep her safe. Get her to family. That was the deal now. Jake walked up to Grace and took the locket from around her neck. She tried to protest, but he held up a hand. He pointed at himself, then at Grace, then made a pulling motion. He was going to get her back. Not today, but soon. He'd take Ruth north to safety, then he'd come back for Grace. He'd track Victor down and get her back or die trying. Grace shook her head, not believing, but Jake pressed the locket into Ruth's hands and made her hold it. A promise. A debt. Ruth would keep the locket until they got Grace back. The older woman looked at him with desperate hope warring with despair. She wanted to believe, but had been disappointed too many times. Grace shouted down to the men. They shouted back, "Agreeable now!" Grace descended slowly, hands raised. The men surrounded her immediately, binding her wrists. One of them roughly checked her for weapons, taking her knife and rifle. They pushed her toward their horses, not gentle about it. Grace didn't fight. She looked back once at Ruth, smiled bravely, and then they were riding away with her to the southeast. Ruth collapsed. Jake had to physically lift her onto her horse. She clutched Grace's locket like a lifeline, tears streaming down her face, body shaking with sobs. Jake mounted the black stallion and took the lead rope of Ruth's horse. They rode north as the sun climbed higher, leaving the outcrop and Grace behind. Ruth cried for 2 hours straight, silent, devastating tears that made Jake's chest ache. He kept them moving, pushing hard, knowing Victor would change his mind eventually and come after them anyway. The deal wouldn't hold. Men like that didn't honor their word. By midday, Ruth had cried herself out. She sat hollow in her saddle, mechanically following Jake's lead. They stopped at a stream and Jake made her drink, made her eat. She moved like a ghost, empty. That night she refused to sleep, just sat staring south toward where Grace was. Jake tried talking to her even though she couldn't understand. Just words to fill the silence, to remind her she wasn't alone. On the 3rd day after losing Grace, Ruth started speaking. Not to Jake, just to the air. Long monologues in her language, sometimes angry, sometimes sad, always desperate.
Jake let her talk. It seemed to help.
She needed to process what happened, needed to voice her grief and rage even if no one understood. They pushed hard for a week, covering territory fast. The black stallion proved tireless, setting a pace Ruth's horse struggled to match. Jake worried about the animal breaking down, but Ruth waved off his concerns. She urged her mount harder, driven by something beyond reason, running toward the goal or away from the memory, maybe both. The landscape changed as they moved north. Red rocks gave way to forests. Dry heat became mountain cold. They were entering Wyoming territory, getting close to Ruth's destination. Jake wondered what waited there. Family, her map had said. But what kind of family? And would they be able to help get Grace back? On day 26 since leaving Arizona, they rode into a valley that made Ruth gasp. She pulled out her map with shaking hands and compared it to the landscape. This was it. The X on her map. She looked at Jake with desperate hope and kicked her horse forward. They followed a creek upstream for 2 miles until they saw buildings. A ranch. Not huge, but well-maintained, with a main house, barn, and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney. People lived here. Ruth rode straight up to the house and dismounted clumsily, exhausted but energized. She pounded on the door. No answer. She pounded again, shouting something. The door opened cautiously, and an older man peered out, gray-haired, weathered, suspicious. He saw Ruth, and his face transformed. Shock, joy, disbelief, wonder. He shouted something and pulled her into a fierce hug. Ruth collapsed in his arms, finally breaking down completely. A woman ran out from the barn. Younger, maybe 40, with Ruth's eyes. She saw them and screamed, joyful and stunned. More people appeared. 2 young men, a teenage girl, an elderly woman. They surrounded Ruth, all talking at once in that same language, crying and laughing and touching her like they couldn't believe she was real. Jake stayed mounted, watching the reunion from a distance. The gray-haired man finally noticed him and approached cautiously. He spoke in heavily accented English. "You bring Ruth home?" Jake nodded. The man grabbed his hand and shook it hard enough to hurt, speaking rapidly in English so broken Jake could barely follow. Thank you. Ruth is my wife. Gone 4 years. We think dead. You bring her home." Ruth called out weakly from the porch. She was being supported by the younger woman. Her daughter, maybe. Ruth pointed at Jake and said something. The gray-haired man's expression changed to understanding. He nodded seriously. "You stay. Rest. Eat. We talk." Jake dismounted gratefully. He'd gotten Ruth to family. First part of the promise kept. That night, the ranch house filled with people and food and stories Jake couldn't understand. Ruth's family spoke their language freely, occasionally translating bits into rough English for his benefit. Her husband's name was Anton. He'd immigrated from somewhere in Eastern Europe 15 years ago, sent for his family later. Ruth and Grace had been traveling to join them when they'd been captured by Victor, a man who trafficked women. They'd been held for 3 years, escaped 6 months ago, been running ever since. Anton wanted details. "Where was Grace?" Ruth explained, crying again. Anton's face darkened. He spoke to the 2 young men, his sons, and they nodded grimly. He turned to Jake. "We go get Grace. Tomorrow. You come?" Jake nodded. That was the plan. Anton clasped his shoulder. "Good. Victor is evil man. Many women he hurt. We kill him, save Grace, end this." The teenage girl, Anton and Ruth's youngest daughter, brought Jake blankets and showed him to a room in the barn. Clean, warm, the first real bed he'd seen in a month. He collapsed into it, exhausted beyond measure. Tomorrow they'd plan the rescue. Tonight he'd sleep. He woke to shouting. Men's voices English. Jake grabbed his gun and ran outside. Dawn was breaking and 5 riders surrounded the ranch house. One of them sat on a familiar black stallion. Jake's heart sank. The horse dealer from Santa Fe. He'd tracked Jake all this way. The dealer saw him and smiled coldly. Finally. "Been chasing you for a month, Carson. Time to collect that reward." Anton and his sons emerged from the house armed with rifles. The dealer's men drew their weapons. "Standoff. This doesn't concern you folks. We just want Carson. Hand him over and we ride away peaceful." Anton looked at Jake. Jake looked at Ruth standing in the doorway, grief and exhaustion etched in her face. He'd promised to get Grace back. If he was arrested now, that promise died. Anton made a decision. He spoke in broken English. "Jake is our guest. He brought Ruth home. You not take him." The dealer laughed. "You're harboring a wanted criminal, old man. That makes you an accessory. We can take you all in if you want." Anton raised his rifle. "You leave our land. Now." The situation balanced on a knife edge. The dealer had 5 men, all armed. Anton had his 2 sons, and Jake, plus Ruth and her daughter, who Jake suspected could shoot based on how they handled themselves. Numbers favored the dealer, but they'd take casualties storming the ranch. The dealer clearly calculated odds, decided it wasn't worth the risk.
He sneered at Jake. "This isn't over, Carson."
I'll be back with a marshal. You've got maybe a day before you're in chains." They rode off. Jake felt sick. He'd brought trouble to these people who'd welcomed him. Anton put a hand on his shoulder. "Is okay. We deal with this. But first, we get Grace. We leave now, before Dealer comes back." Jake nodded gratefully. Anton barked orders and the ranch exploded into motion. Within an hour, they'd assembled a rescue party. Anton, his 2 sons Peter and Dmitri, Jake, and surprisingly Ruth. She refused to stay behind, insisted on coming. Anton argued, but Ruth was immovable. This was her sister. Jake understood that word now, sister. She'd said it enough times. Grace was Ruth's sister, maybe not by blood, but by choice, by survival, by love. They packed weapons, supplies, and information Anton had gathered over the years about Victor's operation. The man ran his trafficking ring out of a fortified compound in southern Utah, near the Arizona border. 3 days hard ride. Anton had been trying to mount a rescue for years, but never had enough information about where Ruth and Grace were being held. Now they knew. Now they could act. They rode out as the sun climbed higher, 6 people on a mission to save 1. The black stallion carried Jake eagerly, sensing purpose. Ruth rode beside him on a fresh horse from Anton's stable, her face set with determination. Whatever grief she'd felt was buried now under cold rage. She was going to get her sister back or die trying. Jake recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own reflection enough times. The first day passed in focused silence. They stopped only to water the horses and grab quick meals. Anton set a punishing pace, driven by the knowledge that Victor would be hurting Grace, making an example of her for escaping. Every hour mattered. Ruth's jaw stayed clenched, her eyes fixed south. That night around the campfire, Peter tried teaching Jake phrases in their language. Basic things he'd need. "Where is Grace?" "Don't shoot. Get down. Run." Jake practiced until his tongue ached from unfamiliar shapes. Dmitri showed him Victor's compound on a crude map, explaining the layout through gestures and broken English. 3 buildings in a rough triangle, walls around the perimeter, guards at the gate. Maybe 20 men total. Victor kept his victims in the western building, his men in the eastern, lived himself in the northern house. Getting in would be hard. Getting out with Grace would be nearly impossible. Anton had a plan, though. They'd arrive at night, breach the western wall, grab Grace, and run before Victor could organize pursuit. Simple, direct, deadly. Lots could go wrong. Anton acknowledged this with a shrug. Sometimes you have to risk everything for family. Everyone nodded. They understood. Day 2 brought them into rougher territory. They saw riders in the distance and hid until they passed. Victor's men, probably. Patrols. The closer they got to the compound, the more dangerous it became. That evening they camped in a canyon, no fire, eating cold food, speaking in whispers. Tomorrow night they'd hit the compound. Jake cleaned his gun, checked his ammunition. 6 bullets now, Anton had given him 3 more. Still not enough, but better than before. Ruth sat apart from them, sharpening her knife with methodical strokes. The sound filled the canyon, metal on stone, patient and deadly. Jake watched her work and felt a chill. This woman would kill without hesitation to save her sister. They all would. Including himself. When had he become someone who'd risk his life for 2 women he'd met a month ago? Somewhere on the trail between Arizona and Wyoming, running from his own past toward theirs, he'd changed. The man who'd only cared about saving himself had died. Someone different sat in this canyon now. On the 3rd day, they reached the compound by afternoon. They hid in the rocks above it, watching, waiting for night. The place looked worse than Dimitri's description. Higher walls, more guards, iron gates that looked impenetrable. Ruth stared at it with naked hatred. She'd been imprisoned there for 3 years. Tortured, starved, used. Grace, too. And now Grace was back there, because she'd sacrificed herself so Ruth could escape. The weight of that sat heavy on all of them. Anton finalized the plan. They'd approached from the west after midnight when the guards changed shifts. There was a spot where the wall was lower, easier to climb. They'd go over fast, 3 of them. Anton, Jake, and Ruth. Peter and Dmitri would stay outside with the horses, ready to cover their escape. They'd head straight for the western building, get Grace, and run. 5 minutes from breach to exit. Any longer and they'd be trapped. The sun set too slowly. Jake watched shadows lengthen across the compound, tried to memorize the layout, prepared himself for violence. When full dark finally came, they ate quickly and checked their gear one last time. Ruth had 2 knives now, 1 in each boot. Her eyes glittered in the starlight, feverish with anticipation. Anton said something to his sons in their language, probably goodbye in case he didn't come back. They clasped hands. At midnight they moved. Silent shadows crossing open ground. The wall rose above them, stone and adobe, maybe 10 feet high. Anton boosted Ruth up first. She scrambled over like a cat, dropping silently on the other side. Jake went next, Anton pushing from below. The compound spread before them, buildings dark except for lanterns near the gates. Guards visible there, 2 of them, focused outward, not in. Anton dropped beside them and they ran for the western building, staying low, using shadows. A dog barked somewhere and they froze. The barking stopped. They reached the building and Ruth tried the door, locked. She pulled out her knife and worked the mechanism. 30 seconds that felt like hours. Then it clicked open. They slipped inside. The smell hit Jake first. Unwashed bodies, fear, despair. His eyes adjusted to the darkness and he saw them. Maybe 20 women in a single long room, sleeping on bare floors, chained to iron rings in the walls. Ruth made a choking sound. This had been her prison. She moved quickly down the room, checking faces, desperate and terrified. Jake and Anton followed, stepping carefully over sleeping forms. Grace wasn't there. They reached the end of the room and Ruth spun around, panicking. She started back, checking again, faster. Still no Grace. She grabbed a woman who'd woken up and spoke urgently. The woman pointed upstairs fearfully. Ruth's face went white. She ran for the stairs. Anton and Jake followed. The second floor had individual rooms, doors locked from the outside. Victor kept some women separate, special punishment or special use. Ruth tried doors frantically, calling Grace's name softly. Behind one door, a weak voice answered. Ruth sobbed and attacked the lock with her knife. It wouldn't open. Anton pulled her back and kicked the door. Once, twice, 3 times. Wood splintered. Grace lay on a mattress in the corner, barely conscious, bruised and bloody. Victor had made good on his threat. Ruth fell beside her, lifting her carefully, speaking through tears. Grace's eyes focused slowly. She saw Ruth and smiled despite everything, touched her face weakly. Sisters reunited. Jake heard shouting outside. The alarm was raised. Boots pounding, men mobilizing. Anton cursed and grabbed Grace's other arm. They lifted her between them and ran for the stairs. Grace couldn't walk on her own, legs giving out. They half-carried, half-dragged her through the first floor, past the chained women who watched with empty eyes or desperate hope. They burst out the door into chaos, guards everywhere converging on their position. Peter and Dmitri were already at the wall, horses ready, firing rifles to keep Victor's men back. Anton ran for the wall, Grace draped over his shoulder. Ruth and Jake covered them, firing at anyone who got close. Jake's gun cracked 3 times. 2 guards went down, one clutched his shoulder. Ruth's knife flew and buried itself in another guard's chest. They reached the wall and Anton literally threw Grace over it. Peter caught her on the other side. Ruth scrambled up. Jake fired his last shots, emptied his cylinder, then climbed. Hands grabbed his ankle from below. He kicked free, pulled himself over, dropped hard on the other side. They ran for the horses through a hail of bullets. Dmitri took one in the leg and stumbled. Peter caught him, kept him moving. They mounted up, Grace barely able to hold on behind Ruth, Dmitri gritting his teeth against pain. Then they were riding, pounding across the desert in the darkness, Victor's men behind them shouting rage and revenge. They rode until the horses were gasping, pushed them until Anton finally called a halt in a narrow canyon. Everyone dismounted, checked each other for wounds. Dimitri's leg bled badly, but the bullet had gone through clean. Ruth tended him while Anton examined Grace. She was conscious now, alert enough to recognize where she was, who she was with. She grabbed Ruth's hand and wouldn't let go. They couldn't stay. Victor would be organizing pursuit with 50 men, maybe more. He wouldn't let this go. They had to get north fast, back to Anton's ranch, gather everyone, and either ford up for a siege or run further. Jake's own problems with the horse dealers seemed small suddenly compared to the army that would be hunting them now. They rode through the night and into the next day, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Grace rallied slowly, the toughness that had kept her alive through 3 years of captivity reasserting itself. By evening, she could ride on her own, though Ruth stayed close, protective, and relieved beyond measure. That night around a small fire, Grace looked at Jake for the first time since her rescue. She pulled out her locket from Ruth's neck where it had been kept safe and put it back on. Then she did something unexpected. She took Jake's hand and placed it over the locket, pressing it to her heart, and spoke. A long sentence in her language, serious and formal. Anton translated. She says you are her brother now. You kept your promise. You brought her home. She owes you her life. We all do. Jake didn't know what to say. He had done what needed doing, nothing special. But the way they all looked at him, this family who'd accepted him without question, who'd risked everything to help him help them, he understood he'd found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Purpose, connection, family. They rode on toward Wyoming and whatever came next, together now in ways that went beyond words or language or borders. 7 people against the world, bound by promises kept and debts unpaid, racing towards safety that might not exist, but chasing it anyway because that's what family did. They kept moving, kept fighting, kept faith. And somewhere behind them, Victor gathered his forces and swore revenge. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight they had each other, and Grace was free, and that was enough. The journey back to Wyoming took 5 brutal days. Dimitri's leg got infected and slowed them down. Anton forced them to stop for a full day while Ruth treated the wound with herbs and whiskey. Grace was recovering but still weak, sleeping most of the ride. They saw Victor's men twice in the distance, always watching, always tracking, playing a long game. On the 3rd day, they crossed into Wyoming territory and everyone breathed slightly easier. Victor had power in Utah and Arizona, but less influence here. Not safe yet, but safer. They pushed harder, knowing they needed the protection of Anton's ranch and whatever help his neighbors might provide. They reached the ranch on the 6th day after the rescue, expecting relief. Instead, they found trouble waiting. The horse dealer had made good on his threat. A federal marshal sat on the porch, badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. 3 deputies with him. The dealer stood nearby, vindicated and smug. Anton's family stood in a cluster near the barn, worried and helpless. The marshal stood as they rode up. Jake Carson. I have a warrant for your arrest.
Cattle rustling. You need to come with me.
Jake's heart sank. After everything, it ended like this. Caught by the law while trying to do the right thing. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. Grace asked Anton something, weak but urgent. Anton explained quickly in their language. Jake watched Grace's face transform from relief to fury. She dismounted carefully and approached the marshal, speaking in her language. The marshal frowned. I don't understand you, miss. Grace grabbed Ruth and pulled her forward, pointing at Anton. Ruth spoke haltingly in English, Anton translating and filling gaps. Ruth explained the past month, how Jake had saved their lives, protected them, risked everything to help rescue Grace. How he'd kept his word when abandoning them would have been easier and safer, how he was a good man caught in a bad situation. The marshal listened, unmoved. That's a touching story, ma'am, but it doesn't change the warrant. The law is the law. Peter, Anton's oldest son, spoke up. The cattle weren't stolen by Jake. Everyone here knows that. The judge's son did it and blamed Jake because Jake had rejected his business proposal. Jake's jaw dropped. How did Peter know that? Peter continued. We have proof. Testimony from 3 ranch hands who saw the judge's son alter the brands. They were too scared to come forward before, but they'll testify now. The marshal's expression shifted slightly. You have witnesses? Peter nodded. They're at the Anderson Ranch, 2 hours south. We can bring them here tonight if you'll wait. The marshal considered. The dealer protested loudly, sensing his reward slipping away. The marshal told him to shut up. To Jake, he said, I'll give you until tomorrow morning. If these witnesses can back up your story, we'll wire the territorial court and get this sorted out. If they can't, you're coming with me. That night, Anton's ranch filled with people. The 3 witnesses arrived, nervous but determined to tell the truth. 2 were ranch hands in their 20s, the 3rd an older cowboy who'd worked for the judge for 15 years. They laid out the whole story. The judge's son was a gambler with debts. He'd rustled his own father's cattle to sell them quietly and pay what he owed. When the theft was discovered, he'd panicked and blamed Jake, who'd been working on the ranch at the time. The judge believed his son without question and issued the warrant. The marshal listened carefully, asked questions, took notes. By midnight, he seemed convinced. He told Jake he'd telegraph the territorial court in the morning recommending the charges be dropped, but Jake would need to stay put until official word came back. Take a week. Maybe 2. Jake agreed, grateful and exhausted. The dealer exploded, demanding his reward, claiming the witnesses were lying. The marshal had had enough. He told the dealer to leave and not come back. The dealer left cursing, but he left. Jake finally allowed himself to hope this nightmare might end. The next week passed in strange normalcy. Jake helped around the ranch, fixing fences, tending animals, learning more of Anton's family language through immersion and necessity. Grace recovered her strength day by day. She and Ruth were inseparable, making up for lost time, speaking constantly in their rapid tongue. Jake caught them watching him sometimes, smiling when he tried to communicate with gestures and broken phrases. Victor remained a shadow on the horizon. Anton heard reports through his community network. Victor was gathering men, planning something. He'd lost face when Grace was rescued. He'd need to respond with violence to maintain his reputation. The question was when and how. Anton called a council on the 8th day. He gathered his sons Jake, several neighbors who'd become involved, and a few men from the immigrant community who had their own grudges against Victor. 20 men total. They met in Anton's barn and planned defense. Victor would come. They needed to be ready. They fortified the ranch over the next few days. Barricades, firing positions, emergency escape routes. Anton sent the women and children to a neighbor's ranch 10 miles away for safety. Ruth and Grace refused to go. They'd fight. They'd earn that right. Anton argued, but they wouldn't budge. Jake understood. They'd been Victor's victims too long. Now they'd be his enemy. On day 12, word came from the territorial court. Jake's charges were dropped. The witness's testimony had been credible enough to force an investigation. The judge's son confessed under pressure, was arrested himself. Jake was free. Officially, legally free for the first time in months. The marshal delivered the news personally, shook Jake's hand, apologized for the trouble. Jake thanked him, lightheaded with relief. Marshal looked around at the fortifications, the armed men preparing for battle. He asked what was going on. Anton explained about Victor, the trafficking, the coming attack. The marshal frowned. That's outside my jurisdiction. This is a local matter. But if you need help after the fact, if there are bodies to explain, come find me. I'll make sure the report reflects self-defense. He rode away and they were alone again, waiting for Victor's arrival. It came 3 days later at dawn. 40 men on horses armed to the teeth, Victor at their head, a tall man with a scarred face and dead eyes. He shouted something in Russian that Grace translated bitterly. He says, "Surrender, Grace, or he kills everyone." Anton shouted back, "Leave our land or die here." Victor laughed and gave an order. His men charged. The battle for Anton's ranch began. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Victor's men tried to storm the main house but met withering fire from the windows. 3 went down immediately. The rest fell back, regrouped, tried the barn instead. Peter and Dmitri held them off with rifles, picking targets methodically. Jake was positioned on the house roof with a clear view of the yard. He'd been given a better rifle with proper ammunition. He made it count. Grace fought like a demon possessed, firing from the second-story window, reloading smoothly, never missing. Ruth fed her ammunition, encouraged her, protected her blind spots. They worked together seamlessly, a 2-person fighting unit born from years of survival. Victor's men tried to burn them out, throwing torches onto the barn roof. Anton's neighbors countered with bucket brigades, dousing flames before they caught. The attack faltered, Victor's men taking casualties, breaking against the defense like waves against rocks. Victor himself stayed back, commanding from a distance, safe from the fighting. Coward. Jake tracked him through the rifle sight, waiting for a clear shot. If Victor died, his men would scatter, cut off the head, and the body died. Simple and effective. The battle raged for 3 hours. Victor's men tried every approach, every tactic. Nothing worked. Anton's defense held. Bodies littered the yard, mostly Victor's men, but some of Anton's neighbors too. Good people who'd risked their lives to protect their own. The cost was high and climbing. Then Grace did something insane. She left the house, ran across the open yard toward the barn, drawing fire.
Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. Ruth screamed, horrified.
But Grace made it to the barn, climbed onto a horse, and rode straight at Victor's position. A suicide run. Jake understood. She was done running, done hiding, done being Victor's victim. She was going to end this herself or die trying. He saw Victor's face register shock, then rage. The man drew his pistol and aimed at Grace. Jake squeezed his trigger first. The rifle cracked and Victor jerked sideways, hit in the shoulder. Not a kill shot, Jake was too far for that, but enough to wound and distract. Grace closed the distance impossibly fast, her horse a blur. She launched herself from the saddle while moving, tackling Victor from his horse. They hit the ground together in a tangle of limbs. Victor's men rushed to help him, but Anton's fighters poured out from their positions, engaging at close range. The battle dissolved into chaos, close quarters fighting, knives and pistols, and desperate grappling. Jake lost sight of Grace in the melee. He climbed down from the roof, grabbed his pistol, and ran toward the fighting. He found her standing over Victor's body, breathing hard, covered in blood. Some hers, most his. Her knife was buried in his chest, dead eyes staring at nothing. Grace swayed on her feet. Jake caught her before she fell. She looked at him and smiled, exhausted and finally free. "Oh, it's over," she said in English, the first English words he'd ever heard her speak. "It's over?" Victor's men saw their leader dead and broke. They ran for their horses, scattered across the prairie, fleeing north and south and east. Anton let him go. It was over. The cost had been terrible. 5 of Anton's neighbors dead, 8 more wounded. But Victor's operation was finished. His compound would be raided and burned. The women he'd held captive would be freed. One monster was gone from the world. They buried their dead that afternoon in a corner of Anton's property, said words Jake didn't understand but felt deeply. The neighbors who'd survived began the journey home. The immigrant community celebrated quietly, aware of the price but grateful for the victory. Grace had killed the devil who'd haunted them for years. She was their hero. In the days after, Grace and Ruth taught Jake more of their language. He still wasn't fluent, but he could communicate now, hold simple conversations, understand the stories they told. Grace told him about their life before Victor, growing up in a small village in Ukraine, immigrating with dreams of prosperity, being captured at the port, and sold into hell. Ruth told him about Anton's years searching for her, never giving up, slowly building the network of information that had eventually led to the rescue, about the guilt she felt for the neighbors who died protecting them, the debt she could never repay. Jake told her that family protected family. That's how it worked. She'd done the same for Grace. The neighbors had chosen to fight. Their sacrifice mattered, but it wasn't her fault. The federal marshal returned 2 weeks later with news. The territorial government was investigating Victor's operation. They'd found his compound, freed 18 women, arrested 3 of his lieutenants. There would be trials. Grace and Ruth would need to testify eventually, tell their stories publicly. Grace nodded. She'd do it. She'd make sure everyone knew what Victor had done, make sure the women he'd trafficked got justice and help returning home. 1 month after the battle, Jake prepared to leave. The Black Stallion was his, fair and square, and the road called to him. He had money saved from working Anton's ranch, new clothes, a good rifle. He could go anywhere, start fresh with his name cleared. California, maybe. Oregon. Somewhere far from memories and violence. Grace found him packing his saddlebags. She handed him a letter written in careful English. An address in San Francisco. Her uncle lived there, ran a shipping business, always needed good men. If Jake wanted work, wanted a place to belong, he had family there now. Grace's family, Jake's family. She said the word in English, family, and hugged him tight. Ruth gave him Grace's locket to carry, said she'd made a copy for herself so he'd remember them, so he'd know he always had a home here with them if he needed it. Anton shook his hand and called him son. Peter and Dmitri clasped his shoulders, brothers in all but blood. Jake rode out at dawn on the Black Stallion, heading west toward California and whatever waited there. Behind him, Anton's ranch grew smaller, the family that had saved him and that he'd saved in return, waving from the porch. Ahead, mountains and deserts and a future undefined. For the first time in years, Jake Carson wasn't running from something, he was riding towards something. Purpose. Peace. Home. The Black Stallion moved smooth and powerful beneath him, the horse that had started this whole journey. The price had been steep but worth every moment. 2 women who spoke no English had known all his secrets and had chosen to trust him anyway. That trust had changed everything, had saved them all. Jake touched the locket in his pocket and smiled. He'd write when he reached San Francisco, tell them about the uncle, about the new life he was building. And someday, when the dust settled and the world felt safe again, he'd ride back to Wyoming and visit. Because that's what family did. They stayed connected across distances, across languages, across everything that tried to divide them. The sun rose golden over the mountains, and Jake Carson rode into it, free at last, carrying the weight of promises kept and lives saved, heading toward a future bright with possibility. The Wild West had tried to break him, but had made him stronger instead. And somewhere in his heart, 2 sisters who'd become family rode with him always, their courage and faith a permanent part of who he was. The road stretched long and beautiful ahead. Jake took a deep breath of morning air and rode on, at peace, at home in his own skin for the first time in his life. The price had been a horse and 2 women who knew his secrets. The reward was everything he'd never known he needed. And that, he thought, was a trade worth making every single time.